Hi, and welcome to Grade 6 History, Social Studies, Understanding Us. My name is Miss Burrows, and this week we are going through part 2 of our Civil War Smarties series. Today we will be learning about events and emancipation. So before we keep moving, I want to make sure that we're feeling okay. I want you to take a deep breath, and once you're done exhaling, I want you to think, am I really ready to do this right now? And if you're not, then take a minute and take care of yourself, get some sunshine, get some rest. If you get out of your deep breath and you feel like I'm ready to keep moving, then let's keep moving. Today you're going to need a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. So here's what's going on. For part 2 of our Civil War for Smarties series, we're going to go through our goals, we're going to go through our words of the day, our guided practice about events and emancipation, and then we're going to end with our mission. Our goals for the day is that by the end of this lesson, we should be able to identify and locate major battles of the Civil War, understand the details and impact of the Emancipation Proclamation, and understand and discuss the impact that African American soldiers, particularly of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, had on the Civil War. These are our words of the day. Union, this is going to refer to those northern states that are going to be led by Commander-in-Chief President Lincoln. That's one side of the war, the North, or the Union. Confederacy, these are the southern states that seceded, and they were led by their president, Jefferson Davis, and that is going to be considered the South part of the war. Emancipate means to set free, especially from legal, social, or political restrictions. So like I said, when we go over the Emancipation Proclamation, we're going to keep in mind that word emancipate. Okay, now sit back and get ready for the Civil War, Events and Emancipation for Smarties T. Okay, so where did we leave off? Well, for Civil War for Smarties Part 1, we ended with the fact that there were a lot of tension between the North and South, the compromises that ended up not really making much of a compromise, and then the South seceded. Once the South secedes, we're going to have our first big event that kind of marks the beginning of the Civil War, firing at Fort Sumter. When those southern states seceded from the Union after Lincoln's election, they took control of a lot of federal properties like post offices. But Fort Sumter was one of the few forts in the South, in South Carolina, that still was under control of the Union. On April 12, 1861, Jefferson Davis realizes, he wants control of the fort. Confederate troops fire, and the Union is outnumbered, and this is going to start the Civil War. Fort Sumter is going to be taken over by Confederates. Fort Sumter is in South Carolina and is letter A on our map. For each event, I'm going to be showing you this map so that way you can do our first goal, which is identify and locate these battles on a map. Okay, after Fort Sumter, number 2, Battle of Bull Run, Manassas. This is considered the first major battle. Fort Sumter is like the first event that kind of gets things started, but this is going to be considered the first battle. So this is named for the town of Manassas in Virginia, and Bull Run is the nearby stream. A lot of reporters and politicians and people and sightseers just kind of showed up because they thought that this was going to be a big one and done event. They believed that this would be the first and only battle of the war, that basically the Union would just smoke the Confederates, go take over Richmond, and then everything would be fine. But soldiers were not really trained. The battle was super messy and quite honestly brutal. The Union soldiers had the advantage until Confederate General Stonewall Jackson claimed victory. Manassas is in Virginia and is going to be letter B on our map. Okay, so after the Union get defeated at Bull Run, Manassas, they've got to come up with a plan. Lincoln wanted better training and a new plan for his Union soldiers, and this is what they come up with. First, they want to take over the Mississippi River. This is going to break up the southern states of Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. Then they want to attack the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, okay? Then the Union Navy has a plan to blockade all of the ports in the South, in Savannah, Georgia, in Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, Louisiana. And if you block the ports, then you can keep supplies from coming in. So this is what that would look like. If you look at this map titled Overview of Civil War Strategy, all of the dotted lines is the blockade around that was going to block those ports in Savannah, Georgia, New Orleans, etc., Charleston. And Here is DC and Richmond. You can see that the blue arrows represent what the Union is trying to do and the red arrows represent what the Confederates is trying to do. I feel like these arrows are a little bit confusing, but I still want to show you this map to show you what I was talking about with the plan or the strategy from the Union. Here's the Mississippi right here. Again, the Union thinks that if they can take control of the Mississippi River, then they can kind of keep some states away from other states in the South. The states that would kind of separate Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, etc., from the other parts of the state or from the South. If they take over Richmond, Virginia, then they can have a little bit of control there. What was the Confederacy strategy? Well, 1, defend their territory. 2, wear down the Union. Invade and attack Union capital in Washington, D.C., like we saw on this map. Washington, D.C. is right here, okay? So that's the Union capital, and this is the Confederate capital, and both capitals want control of their other capital. And then they also had an advantage of defending their own land. A lot of the battles are going to happen in the South, as you kind of saw on the dots on the map, and they have that advantage because they know what it looks like. It's their land. That's why the first 2 years' battles were kind of victories for Confederates, until this happens. Number 3, Emancipation Proclamation. So at first, although the Civil War started over the issue of slavery, it was not originally Lincoln or the Union states' goal to end slavery altogether. They just didn't want it to spread to the new states or the Western states. But then when it looked like the Union was losing the war, Lincoln was getting nervous that European countries would come support the Confederacy. So on January 1st, 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. I want you to go back to that word emancipate and think about what Emancipation Proclamation might mean. This announced that all slave states currently in rebellion, the South, be forever free. However, this did not free slaves in border states or in states controlled by the Union, only states that seceded. But because those states seceded, they ignored the proclamation and slaves were still not freed by their masters. So what is the point of the Emancipation Proclamation if it didn't actually free anyone? Well, it somewhat changed the purpose of the Civil War. Even though they faced a lot of scrutiny and it was difficult to do so, Black Americans could, under the Emancipation Proclamation, now fight in the war. And for them, this became a fight for liberation. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the war starts to change, and you'll see that here. Battle of Vicksburg was in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Ulysses S. Grant becomes the leader of the Union soldiers. They develop a plan to surround Confederate soldiers on the Mississippi River until they surrender. And this is going to achieve that first goal of controlling the Union controlling the Mississippi River. Vicksburg is in Mississippi and is letter E on our map. All right, after Vicksburg is Battle of Gettysburg. Well, these kind of happen around the same time, but we're just going to put them in this order and you'll see why. Gettysburg is considered the turning point of the Civil War. This is when Confederate General Robert E. Lee attacked Union territory, hoping to draw Grant and his troops away from Vicksburg. The Union surrounded the Confederacy on hills that were up high, and that kind of gave them an advantage. There were over 50,000 deaths in 3 days, which is the most ever in US history. This is a drawing to show you how intense this battle was. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, one of the few battles that's fought up north that we really talk about, and it's right here. Okay, number 6, Battle of Atlanta. So after Gettysburg, it's starting to look like there's going to be some extreme protocols needed to really take over the Confederates. Even though the Union seemed like they have the advantage, there's going to be some things that need to happen before they can just totally win. In Atlanta, Georgia, Union forces are commanded by Sherman, and they're attacking Confederate forces commanded by Wood. If you look at this chart, you can see the amount of soldiers involved in each side. Sherman, this is the Union side on the left. Hood, this is the Confederate side on the right. And the grayish, brownish blocks represent how many soldiers there were. So you can already tell that the Confederate soldiers were outnumbered. But then the red block shows you how many of those soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. And there are more Confederate soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, and a higher percentage of them from this battle. Sherman achieved something called total war, which is basically like brutal and total destruction. And this ends up being a Union victory. Battle of Atlanta is in Atlanta, Georgia, which is letter G on our map. Okay, and finally, surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union had 120,000 soldiers here. Confederates had 30,000 soldiers here. And Confederate General Lee is kind of left with this decision. He can either attack or surrender. He chooses to attack, but then he retreats. He finally surrenders April 9th, 1865. This is a drawing to show you what that might have looked like. Over here is Ulysses S. Grant, and this is Robert E. Lee signing to surrender. Appomattox Courthouse is in Virginia, and it's letter C on our map. Before we go into kind of the impact of this and the outcome of the Civil War and the importance of Black soldiers in the Civil War, I want to make sure that we just have where we're talking about concrete down. This is very basic information that we need before we can go into the more intense stuff. So what I want you to do is take a second and look at this map chart and think about the different places that we looked at for each battle. I also want to make the point that I forgot to make earlier that there are more battles than these, right? I'm just showing you the most important ones that mark different turning points in the war and the major turning point, Gettysburg. But all of these battles are a bigger deal. There were a lot of little battles in between. We're gonna do the first one together. So for 1 and 2, they're asking about Gettysburg, both the city and the place where the Battle of Gettysburg happens. That happens in Pennsylvania, right here. This is the state of Pennsylvania, and I just put the abbreviation PA. And the letter that is represented on the map is letter F. I want you to pause and fill in the rest on your own. You can just write this on your little sheet of paper. If you notice, they're all numbered, so you can just number 1 through 14 on your paper and fill this out. You could also make a little bit of a little chart and then unpause the video when you're ready. All right, here are the answers. Check your answers, check your map, and once you feel like you got a good understanding of where this all happened, let's keep moving so we can get into the deeper stuff. Okay, here is probably the most important question of the lesson. Did the end of the Civil War mark the end of slavery? The quick answer is no. The long answer is, let's look at the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was passed in January 1865, which is technically before Lee surrenders, but it's not ratified until December 1865, which is after Lee surrenders. The 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So it's important to know that the 13th Amendment is the legal contract that ends slavery in the United States, but just because it's put into place doesn't mean that slavery actually ends. And there's a lot of complicated language in the 13th Amendment that even keeps that from becoming possible when enacted. So back to one of our goals was figuring out the role of Black soldiers in the American Civil War, specifically the 54th Regiment. So let's look at this and say, who were the 54th Regiment? Well, I got this information from the secondary source at history.com. They were a volunteer Union regiment. They were the second all-Black Union regiment to fight in the Civil War. And this is a quote from history.com. They were known for their bravery and fierce fighting against Confederate forces. How did the 54th Regiment get started? This is also from history.com. 1 month after Emancipation Proclamation, Massachusetts governor calls for Black soldiers. More than 1,000 men across different states volunteered. Governor chose a young white man named Robert Shaw to lead them. Now, I want us to go back to when we learned about the Emancipation Proclamation just a few minutes ago. It's important to remember that this only somewhat changed the goal of the war, but definitely changed the goal of the war for Black soldiers. It took them a long time to be allowed to fight as a soldier in the war. And then once they finally do, this war and fighting in it becomes an act of liberation. Not only are they seen as humans for the first time by being allowed to even be a soldier, but they're also out there feeling like they're fighting for their freedom. That's how they see the Civil War. It's important to know that that's not how all soldiers saw the Civil War, but Black soldiers truly saw the fighting in the Civil War as acknowledgement of their humanity and a fight for their freedom. I want to just read this straight from history.com because they wrote it better than I could, and this is going to give you information about what specifically happened with the 54th Regiment once they were put together in Boston, where they're going to go, and what's eventually going to happen. At 9 o'clock in the morning on May 28, 1863, the 54th 1,007 Black soldiers and 37 white officers gathered in the Boston Common and prepared to head to the battlefields of the South. They did so in spite of an announcement by the Confederate Congress that every captured Black soldier would be sold into slavery, and every white officer in command of Black troops would be executed. Cheering well-wishers, including the anti-slavery advocates William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Frederick Douglass, lined Boston streets. "I know not," Governor Andrews said at the close of the parade, "where in all human history to any given 1,000 men in arms there has been committed a work at once so proud, so precious, so full of hope and glory as the work committed to you." That evening, the 54th Infantry boarded a transport ship bound for Charleston. Now, what happens when they get to Charleston is Shaw and the 54th arrive, and they're basically asked to participate in a raid. They're mad because they feel that they came to fight for freedom, not just destroy towns. He asked if they could charge on a battlefield. This is a photo of them storming Fort Wagner. When they got to Fort Wagner, the Confederate soldiers were increasingly more than the Union soldiers, meaning the Union soldiers had miscalculated. They were outnumbered by over 1,000. 280 of the 600 of the 54th Regiment who charged were killed, and Shaw was killed as well. Confederate soldiers disrespected and dumped their bodies in an unmarked trench. But there were a couple of successes thereafter, and the 54th Regiment stood as the symbol of bravery. I want to show you this primary source, and I totally understand that it's very difficult to read, so thank goodness for the brave historians who have translated this for us so that we don't have to read this tiny writing on this faded paper. This is a letter from Sergeant Francis Fletcher to his friend. Sergeant Francis Fletcher was a Black soldier in the 54th Regiment, and sergeant was the highest ranking that you could have as a Black soldier at that time. He is writing to his friend, and he is speaking about the way that African-American soldiers are paid in comparison to white soldiers. I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to kind of discuss it. While I'm reading it, I want you to be thinking about what exactly he's trying to say, and maybe list a few points of his on your note. "You take a far more liberal view of things than you could in my situation. Just 1 year ago today, our regiment was received in Boston with almost an ovation. And at 5 p.m., it will be 1 year since we were safely on board, transport clear of Battery Wharf and bound to this department. In that 1 year, no man of our regiment has received a cent of monthly pay, all through the glaring perfidy of the U.S. government. I cannot anymore condemn nor recite our wrongs, but console myself that one who is able has his vengeance is mine, and I will repay. All the misery and degradation suffered in our regiment by its members' families is not atoned for by the passage of the bill for equal pay. Sergeant Francis Fletcher." So a couple of things. I want you to remember that in the beginning, we introduced the 54th Regiment as a volunteer squad. But it's important to know that even if there were volunteers at this time, Black soldiers who were paid close to $7 per month, and white soldiers were paid close to $13 per month. So he's highlighting that difference between them, and he's basically saying, we've gone through a lot of misery and degradation and suffering, and we deserve this. And just by passing this bill that will be passed just a few weeks actually after he writes this letter to pay Black soldiers the same amount, it doesn't atone, meaning it doesn't make up for all of the injustice that happened prior to. Okay, Today's mission is going to involve this monument, okay? This is a monument dedicated to the 54th Regiment that is located in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. Instead of giving you my own words to explain it, I decided I would quote another historian, Kevin Levin. This is published in the Atlantic, and this is his story or his kind of take on the monument. The Shaw Memorial, which is this right here, is unlike any other Civil War monument. In many ways, the stern and brave faces of Shaw and the men under his command, marching off to a battle that we know they will not survive, has become central to how many Americans now remember Black Civil War soldiers and, more generally, the war itself. It wasn't always this way. For much of the 20th century, the Shaw Memorial was left in disrepair. It was only after the busing crisis of the 1970s that city leaders restored it as a symbol of racial healing. Its restoration also reflected changes in our scholarly understanding of the roles of Blacks in the Civil War. In comparison to other monuments, such as Thomas Ball's Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, D.C., the Shaw Memorial depicted Black soldiers as men who played an active role in pushing the boundaries of race and citizenship. The strong feelings that many of us feel in the wake of this event reflect our embrace of this particular narrative. What you will do today is these 3 things. The first thing I want you to do is list 3 things you see. It's really important when you do this that you not try to jump to conclusions. All I want you to do is list things you see. For example, Ms. Burroughs sees a horse. Number 2, I want you to make 3 historical observations. So everything you wanted to do for number 1, where you wanted to kind of guess what this means and what that means, you want to make 3 guesses of what this is trying to tell you using your historical knowledge of what I've taught you today. Number 3, in 2 to 3 sentences, I want you to go back and reflect on Kevin Levin's words. Unlike most Civil War monuments, this monument highlights the active role of Blacks in the Civil War. When I say reflect, I want you to agree, disagree, respond. That's what I mean by reflect. And use evidence. I want you to remember that there is a lot more to learn about this topic. When I introduced this in Civil War Part 1, I told you that this is so not all there is to it. The Civil War itself is a huge topic. And I encourage you to arm yourself with knowledge, especially now. I'll be posting more resources for you so that you can do that. Thank you so much for trusting me to teach you, and I will see you soon.